There was an extra festival on the calendar, a new myth to celebrate, because a nation which had never previously existed was about to win its freedom, catapulting us into a world which, although it had 5,000 years of history, was nevertheless quite imaginary, a mythical land, a country which would never exist except by the efforts of a phenomenal collective will, except in a dream we all agreed to dream. India, the new myth, a collective fiction in which anything was possible, a fable rivaled only by the two other mighty fantasies, money and God.
Ever since the publication of Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children in 1981, our country has seen a remarkable explosion of literary activity in English. Several novels have achieved critical acclaim both in India and abroad, and many of them have also enjoyed commercial success. In spite of the wide public attention that it enjoys now, novel writing in English does not have a long history in our country. Though it may be considered to have begun in the 1930s, there is no continuous tradition.
The earliest one we can trace back to is 1864. A novel called Rajmohan's Wife by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, and not many people know that Bankim Chandra, who became well known not only in Bangla but in all the other Indian languages in translation, originally had started writing in English. Just one novel, Rajmohan's Wife, which was serialized in a Calcutta-based magazine called Indian Field. And then he switched over to Bangla. The next novel was Durgesh Nandini, and he never looked back. He never wrote. He never attempted to write in English.
Though there have been a few instances of Indian writers writing in English after Bankim, it was only in the 1930s that the Indian English novel became visible with the emergence of three major writers, Mulk Raj Anand, R.K. Narayan, and Raja Rao. Just as Ravi Varma used Western techniques of painting to portray Indian life, Raja Rao, Mulk Raj Anand, and R.K. Narayan took up Western genres of the novel to articulate their own perception of cultural space and experience. Positioned between widely different cultural worlds, pre-independence Indian writers in English often drew their inspiration from India's narrative traditions, while at the same time were shaped by influences from abroad. While Mulk Raj Anand's novels revolve around themes of exploitation and repression of the marginal classes of Indian society, in Raja Rao's The Serpent and the Rope, India is represented as a spiritual and cultural unity, the guru of the world.
It was India I wanted to see, the India of my inner being. Just as I could now see Antarkasi, the inner Benares, India was a continuity I felt, not in time, but in space. As a cloud that stands over a plain might say, "Here I am, and I pour," and goes on pouring. The waters of that rain have fertilized our minds and hearts, and being without time, they are ever present. It is perhaps in this sense that India is outside history.
While Raja Rao constructs an Advaitic Brahmanic India, R.K. Narayan has employed the English language and English literary conventions to map the social life of the imaginary South Indian town, Malgudi, across a long series of novels.
I think they really made this kind of writing visible. And if you talk of a tradition, maybe it goes back to that time. Otherwise, I don't know if it is a tradition, because a tradition has to have a continuity of a kind.
I think all writers would like to belong to some tradition, even if they choose in the end to reject it. And I think for writers in English, living in India particularly, it is a difficult thing to say that you belong to a particular family, whether it's region or language or nationality. Being placed as we are, you know, somewhere between India and the West, but at the same time living here with all the other day-to-day Indianness of our existence. I would say that this is one of the handicaps of being an Indian writer in English, that you don't actually have a family. You feel like a foster child.
But I think lineages and traditions are things that are manufactured by academic curricula. You know, if you're a writer in England, where Englit is such a developed industry, what happens is that people are always drawing up canons, drawing up lineages, drawing up traditions for people to belong to. I think one of the fortunate things about being an Indian novelist in English in the 1980s or 90s is that you don't have an oppressive tradition behind you. You have a tradition in the sense that there are people who have written in English for at least 100 years. I mean, Bankim wrote in English. His first novel was in fact written in English. So there are forebears that you can choose if you want to. But equally, there isn't a kind of oppressive tradition that presses down upon you.
Well, we had quite a lot of pre-independence writers, but don't forget English was in a state of siege earlier. In the heyday of the national movement, you know, people were suspicious of anything connected with the English, including their language. You still had some novelists and poets writing in English. Post-independence, it was very, very severe, and anyone who attempted to write in English was accused of a kind of cultural betrayal almost. There were no grants given really for good writing in English. There were no prizes. The Sahitya Academy gave its first award in English as late as 1962, and that was R.K. Narayan.
It is from the 1930s that, you know, people, I can name writers who come one after the other, a whole bunch of writers together, 50s, 60s. And then there are writers like Nayantara Sehgal, Anita Desai. In between there have been writers like Khushwant Singh, who also is continuing today, Bhavani Bhattacharya, then Manohar Malgunkar. These are all, you know, older generation writers.
In the 40s you had people, I don't know why they didn't attract as much attention then as they do now. There's Desani, all about H. Hatter, which is still treated as a seminal work. You know, it was almost forgotten for about 30 years. And then reissued in 1970, and people said, good God, you got this wonderful masterpiece, how did we forget it?
I did enjoy In Custody. but it was a different kind of writing. It seemed to me very beautiful, but a certain kind of refined existence that I certainly didn't know very much about. I was also a little anxious about how far one can carry this unhappy, slightly neurotic Mem Sahib world. I don't say this in a disparaging sense. I think all writers, and especially women writers, know how difficult it is to treat this subject with the right amount of seriousness, without diminishing, without overdoing.
But for a long time, the Indian writer had to defend himself. And it's only people like Kamala Das and so on who got strident, as to why they're writing in English and, suddenly saying, well, this is my language, this is my voice. So there was a fair amount of self-defense involved too.
In his foreword to Kantapura, published in 1938, Raja Rao set out to underline in a self-reflexive tone the essentially bilingual character of his undertaking.
The telling has not been easy. One has to convey in a language that is not one's own, the spirit that is one's own. One has to convey the various shades and omissions of a certain thought movement that looks maltreated in an alien language. I use the word alien, yet English is not really an alien language to us. It is the language of our intellectual makeup, like Sanskrit or Persian was before, but not of our emotional makeup. Our method of expression, therefore, has to be a dialect which will someday prove to be as distinctive and colorful as the Irish or the American. The real language problem: how to bend it, how to shape it, how to make it be our freedom, how to repossess its poisoned walls.
One sees the effect of Rushdie in the early 80s. He sort of released the Indian tongue and the imagination, and somehow I think made it evident that people can write in their own ways. He broke rules. He created a sort of Indian idiom.
I'm not suggesting that Rushdie was necessarily a literary model, but what he was an inspiration. An inspiration in the sense that not only did he write a wonderful novel, he wrote a wonderful novel that was hugely successful. Most particularly, it won the Booker, it got enormous publicity. I think young Indians who had a proclivity towards writing felt that it's possible.
This novel appealed to certain needs that an entire generation was feeling. One was bringing in history, bringing in the larger history of the country in relation to the personal history. And history becomes part of fiction in this novel. Another is, in a way, the suppressed history comes to the surface.
A kind of sterile debate about the authenticity of English, about its legitimacy as a language for Indian writers. All of that was dispelled not through learned Eng-lit-crit argument, not by professors discussing whether this was in fact appropriate or not, but simply by example.
I think what was really ultimately exciting about Midnight's Children was that this problem of language, which has always been hanging over us, as if it is the identity. There are so many other identities, all mixed up, whether it's caste or gender or class, region. Language, of course, links up with class. I'm not saying it's a separate strand.
There is a novel called Trottanama. You must have read that. It's 1988, I think. Now, I find Alan Seeley, who's the author, he was writing about the writing of Trottanama, and he says that Trottanama was written, of course, published after Midnight's Children, but it was started much earlier. And he changed the book because he too had a hero who was born in 1947 and whose personal history was going to coincide with the history of the nation. And it seems to me too much of a coincidence, and therefore sometimes I think that Midnight's Children was not an accident. Maybe the history of India was preparing towards a point when somebody or the other had to write Midnight's Children. So India was writing it, in a way.
The inner monologues of all the so-called teeming millions of masses and classes alike jostled for space within my head. In the beginning, when I was content to be an audience, before I began to act, there was a language problem. The voices baffled in everything, from Malayalam to Naga dialects, from the purity of Lucknow Urdu to the southern slurrings of Tamil. I understood only a fraction of the things being said within the walls of my skull. Only later, when I began to probe, did I learn that below the surface transmissions, the front of mind stuff, which is what I'd originally been picking up, language faded away and was replaced by universally intelligible thought forms which far transcended words. But that was after I heard, beneath the polyglot frenzy in my head, those other precious signals, utterly different from everything else, most of them faint and distant, like far-off dreams whose insistent pulsing eventually broke through the fish market cacophony of my voices, the unconscious beacons of the children of midnight.
I think it's a function of the empire having receded. It's a community that is intellectually and culturally much more confident than it used to be. I think Rushdie's writing to some extent recognized that, but the time was ripe for many other people to recognize it too. And it's been going on not only in the field of creative writing, but in the sciences, in academic work, in filmmaking.
So you have this phenomena of early novelists trying to tell the world about India, our customs, manners, joint family, food habits, Diwali, Holi, that kind of thing, and it became a kind of a concealed guidebook to India, and that didn't make for good writing. Thereafter, no. I mean, people like Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, although he used a lot of Indianisms, they come in so naturally that you don't realize that he is deliberately trying to inject Indians.
He's not, totally Indian in the way that Ghosh and Chatterjee are.
I don't know what you define as being totally Indian.
Experience.
Because, the way...
He hasn't grown up here for as long as those two have, so...
But the way Rushdie describes Bombay, for example, is an immediate experience. If you've grown up in Bombay, or even if you just visited Bombay, all the name places, all the directions, the evocations are so immediate that you would no way would you say he's not grown up or he's not a Bombayite or not Indian or whatever. You can. But then isn't that where your experience, your nationality exists really in memory, because you can grow up in a certain place and not belong to it.
I was going to say memory really mythicizes
sure, but everything mythicizes experience. So as you talk about experience, you're mythicizing experience. What is this weightage of being Indian or having grown up in India?
In a multilingual environment, and all middle-class writers in India, let it be said, are bilingual. You would, even the smallest mufassil, a person who wrote for publication, would write in a world where at least 2 languages were used. So in a bilingual or multilingual world, the main problem in front of an Indian writer is how do you render lives that occur in more than one language into one language? And that's what I think sets Narayan and Rushdie and Amitav Ghosh and Shashi Tharoor and Vikram Seth apart from, if you will, their foreign counterparts from monolingual cultures.
How do you capture the multilingual reality of India by using only one language, English? I think Vikram Seth does it, because you can tell each person's English is different. You know who is actually speaking in English and who is actually not speaking in English, but he's giving you the rendering in English.
That is what distinguishes us from other writers from monolingual cultures. I don't think the important distinction is whether you feel English was Raja Rao's first language, was not his first language, whereas it was Rushdie's.
I don't think anybody writes in a language which is not his or her first language.
Vikram Seth, I think, is even a better example. His Suitable Boy has a tone of authenticity about it. He's written it about 1953 period of India. He's done a lot of work. There's not one single error of fact.
He doesn't do any of these, you know, the technical feats that some of these more adventurous contemporaries do. He just tells you a plain story with a great deal of detail. So much detail that if you don't know the world, you will come to know the world. And I have a feeling that there is a kind of human core to the novel which will last.
A Suitable Boy celebrates with a confident prolixity the idiosyncrasies of Indian life.
Why have you brought me here?
Do you know Lander?
Lander? No.
You have never heard of Walter Savage Lander?
Oh yes, Walter Savage Lander, of course. Roselmeyer, whom these watchful eyes.
Wakeful. Well, she lies buried here, as does Thackeray's father and one of Dickens' sons, and the original for Byron's Don Juan.
Really? Ah, what avails the sceptred race?
Ah, what the form divine!
What every virtue, every grace!
Roselmeyer, all were thine. May weep, but never see.
A night of memories and sighs.
I consecrate to thee.
So she was 20 when she died?
Yes, just about your age. They met in the Swansea Circulating Library, and then her parents took her out to India. Poor Lander, noble savage.
What did she die of? The sorrow of parting?
A surfeit of pineapples. I can see you don't believe me, but it's true. It's true. So, you will be back at Christmas?
I think so.
Good, good, good. There are lots of concerts of Indian classical music in winter, and Calcutta is very pleasant. I'll show you around. I'll dispel your ignorance. I'll expand your mind. I'll teach you Bangla.
I look forward to it.
I like Shadow Lines very much. I rate it one of the best novels in the English language published by an Indian.
The most admirable thing about Shadow Lines is the way in which the narrative moves in time and place with such economy of effort and with such evocative beauty. It's really a very beautiful book.
Amitav Ghosh's Shadow Lines speculates on the varieties of human freedom and the bonds across space and time. The shadow lines we draw between people and nations.
Have you gone mad? What do you think you are doing there?
Listen, Ela, it's over. Let's forget it.
No, we won't forget it. We will not forget it. Just tell me, what do you think you are doing there?
Listen, Ela. You shouldn't have done what you did. Girls don't behave like that.
What the fuck are you saying? What do you mean, girls don't? I'll fucking do what I want, when I want, and where?
No, not if I'm there.
Why not? Why fucking not?
You can do whatever you feel like in England, but not here. There are certain things you cannot do here. That's how we live. That's our culture.
Do you see now? Do you understand now?
See what? Understand what?
Do you see now? Do you see now? Do you see why I chose to live in London? Because I want to be free.
Free of what?
Free of you and your bloody culture. Free of all of you.
You can never be free of me. If I were to die tomorrow, still you would not be free of me. Because I am within you.
just as you are within me. So that was what I told my grandmother as she lay in her sickbed glaring at me. I told her that Ella lived in London only because she wanted to be free. But I knew I had made a mistake the moment I said it. I should have known that she would have nothing but contempt for a freedom that could be bought for the price of an air ticket. For she too had once wanted to be free.
It's not freedom that she wants. All she wants is to be left alone to do what she pleases. But that is not what it means to be free.
I began to wonder whether it was I that was mad, because I was happy to be bound, whether I was alone in knowing that I could not live without the clamor of the voices within me.
The grandmother and Ella, they seem to be so isolated in time and place. I mean, they are limited characters. And somehow the author's sympathy is with the unnamed narrator and Tridib, who have this tremendous spatial imagination, cartographic imagination. They can think of other countries, other people. They are fluid in their ideas. Whereas Ella is narrowly limited, and the grandmother in her own way is narrowly nationalistic.
They know they are a nation because they've marked their borders with blood. War is their religion. That is what it takes to make a country. Once that happens, people forget what they were born. Hindus or Muslims, Bengalis or Punjabis. They become one family, born of the same pool of blood. That is what you have to achieve for India.
There is a gender dimension to this whole question of how free one's imagination can be. Women's imaginations are not shown as free.
Of course, your gender determines your experience, your denied experience, your access to power, your access to books, the media, publishers and so on, to some extent. But really what women writers have to face is the kind of problem any other middle-class working woman has to face. A kind of problem with saying, look, I too am part of this space. I have always liked the story that comes whole and well-rounded, complete with annotation. But mostly I have come across the sharp, jagged, tip of the iceberg variety, and I have always been foolish enough to ask a question. I must have asked my grandmother why thousands of times. She must have answered me. There were few questions she could resist. But I was a child then, and the answers I now reconstruct were perhaps never really hers. Perhaps I put the oracular, paradoxical words into her generous, buck-toothed mouth each time I recall the fables of childhood. In a sense, I think Vasu Master's discovery in The Ghosts of Vasu Master, that he has to throw the conventional syllabus out of the window and that he has to invent his own syllabus, storytelling, to communicate with this silent child. In a sense, that parallels, I think, my own route as a writer.
In order to articulate their own cultural experience, contemporary Indian English writers have often drawn from indigenous narrative traditions such as the embedded storytelling conventions of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, tales from the Arabian Nights, or the oral narrative structures of the Puranas.
Of course, in The Thousand Faces of Night, it's a fairly straightforward use of myth to enlarge the spaces of these women. And I have occasionally twisted a myth or two. But in The Ghosts of Vasu Master, the fables, though they have a certain ancestry, a certain lineage you can trace, are original.
We talk about Indian English writing also representing a specifically Indian expression or Indian identity. But how representative is this Indian identity? Because most of English writing in India, today's generation, is an urban experience, unlike, say, the earlier ones. So how true is this representation?
It is a fact to be acknowledged that in modern Indian fiction, it is mostly about urban this thing, but that is because the author comes from such a this thing and he cannot write anything other than that.
But the question isn't, like somebody just said, is it the language that determines it?
Older generation of novelists believed, like a lot of people in that generation, that the real India was village India. People no longer believe that only village India is a true India. So there's also confidence in writing about what you know and a lack of guilt, I think. In addition to the recognition that wonderful scholarly work is coming out in English, and why not write novels in English too? So it's just that English has become an Indian language, and people no longer feel guilty that English is their mother tongue in the way that they probably did in the post-independence period.
English August was a cult book, I think, when it first came out. Quite frighteningly so, but it was something that everybody said, this is my experience. If you look at Shadowlines, it's an urban book, not only about urban India, but about urban England, and draws a very strong parallel connection between these two places. So is English August, so is Midnight's Children.
While pre-independence writers were concerned in different ways in recovering an identity fragmented and displaced under colonialism, several contemporary English novels like Shadowlines question the idea of nationhood.
Like all the children around me, I grew up believing in the truth of the precepts that were available to me. I believed in the reality of space. I believed that distance separates, that it is a corporeal substance. I believed in the reality of nations and borders. I believed that across the border there existed another reality. The only relationship my vocabulary permitted between those separate realities was war or friendship. There was no room in it for this other thing.
But by the end of the novel, some of these certainties are shattered.
I think of late, in let us say 30, 40 years after independence, there is a fresh thinking about, is there a homogenized concept called Indian? Does one have to belong to any particular category to be called Indian? So this questioning, I think it so happens that Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, whether it is a cause or the effect of this questioning, I don't know, but from that point it seems to begin.
I ended up writing a novel about partition. I ended up writing a quasi-historical or a pseudo-historical novel about partition because I wanted to make it clear to the reader that this was a world created by a contemporary, created by a person who had never lived partition, whose claim to writing about partition was not that he had lived through it, but that he lived with its consequences. An hour of every visit was spent listening patiently to Dadi's first-person account of the struggle for independence. In the early days, it was an epic tale. She gave me a wide-angle picture of the Gandhian decades. But after the first few visits, she zoomed in on the great sword satyagraha led by the Mahatma in 1930. There, in the High Theatre of Civil Disobedience, Dadi replayed with ever more detailed props the single scene of which she was the heroine. I have a contemporary protagonist falling into the past in the most improbable conceivable way, and then living through these 4 or 5 years between 1942 and 1947.
In the novel, there is a whole lot of people who become invisible. And that invisibility figuratively refers to the invisibility of the people who did not want partition, the Muslims who did not want partition. They were erased out of history. And what he does is that instead of using it as a metaphor, he uses it literally. He makes them invisible. And Rushdie taught many of these younger writers that metaphor and fact can be interchanged.
It was all too elaborately meaningful, his jigsaw. First, cut your country into pieces with your own hands. Then, put it together piece by piece to understand how complex Indian unity is, how hard to build. Those significant instructions. The jigsaw was to teach congressmen that they were dropping their Muslim pieces. Masroor wanted to raise consciousness through puzzles, like some progressive kindergartenist. But this was a grown-up world. Suddenly, I felt decades older than my hero.
I've never written any language I know. I read Urdu and Punjabi, but I write in English. I translate from those languages into English. It gives me a much wider audience and brings me much more money.
Most of the money comes from the West. Vikram Seth was not paid all that much by Penguin India, but he was paid by a great deal of money by his British publishers. So maybe they are, somewhere at the back of their mind, trying to cater to a Western audience as well, because that's where things really sell and that's where they make their money.
I'm sure they do, in the sense that publishing is an economic phenomenon. It's not divorced from that altogether. But people have been publishing Indian writers long before the so-called globalization of the world's economy started off.
With Penguin, the whole thing changed. Our concentration was on fiction. And we opened a new avenue for Indian writers writing fiction or short stories or even poems. And it was suddenly successful. It's only a little over 10 years ago that the Penguin opened in India. And it opened the eyes of the publishing world here that it could be done.
Every day I get maybe 2 or 3 manuscripts unsolicited, which is really a lot. And of that, it's only a fraction, a very, very small fraction, that I'd be able to make into a book.
Of the manuscripts I get, I think 90% I reject after reading the first 20, 30, 40 pages. And I describe myself as the rejecter of manuscripts.
We live in times where instant packaging is very desirable. It's very attractive.
If Anurag Mathur is advertised on a billboard, nobody knows who G.P. Deshpande is.
I think there is, in fact, so much hype, free-floating hype in the atmosphere that there is even too much hype about hype.
Well, they all belong, I think, to a fairly rich intellectual climate. It is bubbling at present. And I've mentioned this earlier. If you've got your scientists and economists and so on, our novelists and so on are also reacting to the work that's being done in these fields over here. They're part of the debate that's going on in India.
So this globalization certainly has a great deal to do with this. This African writer, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who writes both in Gikuyu and in English, he came to India a few months ago, and I learned 2 lovely phrases from him. One was the tyranny of monolingualism, and the other was capitalist fundamentalism. I think both these terms apply very well to this sudden growth of Indian writing in English. Mind you, I'm not saying that these are not good novels. I'm not saying that we don't have a very talented young generation writing. But I'm saying that they are getting visibility because it's all coinciding with something happening in the marketplace.
So the problem seems to be with a certain kind of nasty global kit that has come down to our media in recent times. Indian literature is this package of 3.5 well-known international jet-setting Indian writers. And of course they write in English. This is simply not true. Not one of us believes it.
Though publication in regional languages far outnumber the English ones, our novels in English may give a totalizing image of India's literary world, while in fact it is just one lively expression of a profoundly plural and multilingual society.
Reality can have metaphorical content. that does not make it less real. 1,001 children were born. There were 1,001 possibilities which had never been present in one place at one time before. And there were 1,001 dead ends. Midnight's Children can be made to represent many things according to your point of view. They can be seen as the last throw of everything antiquated and retrogressive in our myth-ridden nation, whose defeat was entirely desirable in the context of a modernizing 20th century economy, or as the true hope of freedom, which is now forever extinguished.